Okay, good morning, everyone. We still have a few people joining us, but in the interest of time, let's get started. My name is Ben Bingle, and I'm the Director of Grants and the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership. And I want to thank you for joining us today for the third webinar in our Philosopher Manager series. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we'll be recording today's webinar, and that recording will be sent to you later on along with an evaluation form so you can provide feedback about today's training. We also have everyone muted, but we encourage you to feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom, and we'll save some time at the end to address questions that you submit. Like usual, we'll plan to have right around 50 minutes of content and then approximately 10 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So with that, today's webinar focuses on communications, something that we all do almost all day long. And we're really fortunate to have Paul Lalonde back to lead us through today's content. A little bit about Paul's background. Paul is the Vice President of People and Culture at CEDA of Cook County, which is a community action agency, nonprofit organization that helps low-income people throughout Cook County. He's also the owner of HR Logic, which is a small consulting business specializing in helping nonprofits solve their HR challenges. Paul's passionate about people and doing the right thing. He draws from a broad range of experiences as a nonprofit professional, public speaker, adjunct professor, and a writer on his blog, The HR Philosopher, which is in place to inspire others to pursue philosophy as a means to better themselves and their relationships. I really enjoyed the first two sessions, Paul, and am eager to get going on part 3. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Ben, and thank you again for that introduction and inviting me back for this 3-part series. And I'm almost somewhat sad that it's ending today, but more happy that it even happened. So with that, we will dive into part 3, which is communication in philosophy. So again, I always start out these, kind of talking about why do we study philosophy? Are you doing it just to bloviate and sound intelligent? If you are, then you're doing it wrong. Henry David Thoreau said to be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts or even to found a school. It is to solve some of the problems of life, not theoretically, but practically. So we study philosophy to become better people, to become better leaders, to become the best version of ourselves. So we have to ask questions. And in the context of communication, we should be asking, what do we communicate? How do we communicate it? When? To whom? Why? Do we communicate thoughts, meanings, ideas, feelings, messages, values? The mistake, though, is just asking these questions in our personal lives. A lot of people like to say there's a dichotomy between work life and personal life. That's false. The two blend together, and you cannot have one without the other. To be your whole person means having work and personal together. So if philosophy is to exist in one, it must exist in the other. So if it exists in your personal life, it exists in the boardroom, it exists at the assembly line, at the welcome counter. To be a philosopher is to be a person of action. Philosophy belongs in the real world. So with that, some of the discussion topics will be just a quick recap of what the Philosopher Manager is. We're going to talk about perception and 2 of my favorite topics, the Socratic Method and logical fallacies. We're going to talk about right speech, and then how all these ideas and philosophical components can be applied in the workplace and should be thought of in the workplace. And then we'll go over, just to show you, share all the resources I've used to create these last 3 presentations. And then hopefully we'll all join around the Agora again to ask questions and have comments. So real quick, again, philosophy is the inquiry into understanding our reality, understanding knowledge, and how we should live. Philosophy literally translates love of wisdom, but it's not just theory, it's action. For philosophy to be meaningful, it has to be put into practice. So why study? As taken from the Stoics, we study philosophy to become a better person, to become better human beings. If we do anything else with it, is, as Friedrich Nietzsche said, just a critique of words by means of other words. So what is that action? That action is the 4 cardinal virtues, which is wisdom, moral insight, courage, physical and moral strength, temperance, which is self-control, moderation, and justice, fairness. In Plato's Republic, the Republic was the name of his city, and it was led by a philosopher. He said for any cities or any humanity to become what he called the true city, the true republic, they need either kings need to become philosophers or philosophers need to become kings. And this came from his idea of the allegory of the cave. And just real quick and skinny, think of the Matrix. All of us live in life, we're all plugged into the Matrix, and we have no idea that we're plugged into the Matrix and how everything is fake and not real around us. Kings can figure out how to disconnect from the Matrix to see the world for what it truly is. That is a philosopher king. They're the people that leave the cave. They're the people that leave the Matrix. So that was true leader to Plato. And his criteria was what makes a philosopher a philosopher? What makes a true leader, a true manager, in my context, a true manager? One, they have to love wisdom and philosophy. They have to be selfless, intelligent, reliable, willingness to live a simple life. They don't use their status for themselves. They use their status to help others. And they pursue virtue and goodness. So that's a recap of the philosopher king and how I like to apply all those into management style. So communication, again, it's an art form, right? Everyone always talks about how we need to be better communicators. We need to communicate better at work. But no one ever really tells you what that really means. That's because it means something different to everybody, right? That's why it's an art form. And just like all arts, all skills, you need to use it regularly so that you can grow with it. So perception's the ability to see, hear, become aware of something through our senses. For the context of this conversation, that's listening. Now remember, there's a distinct difference between hearing something and listening to something. To truly hear someone's thoughts, we need to listen to them. This is the first step in really true, effective communication. The issue is a lot of our thoughts, ideas, we can't really have other people perceive them, right? It's all in our own minds, and that's the idea of trying to get it out of our mind into somebody else's. And our world is colored differently by our experience than anyone else's. So the question we have to ask is, how can I know the thought of others, and how do I know I'm hearing them correctly? And vice versa, how do I know that they are hearing me correctly? So communication is the key to everything. We hear that all the time. It's cliche, but it's the truth. As a leader, a manager, you can't fly into this and just give orders, or even take orders, right? Communication leads to learning. It leads to understanding. And communication helps open people's minds. Even if you don't agree with their views, coming to a better understanding of it really helps deepen the relationship between folks. And since communication can be a style of teaching, there's really 2 types of teaching. There's the lecture, and then there's a question and answer session. So to find out our own perception and other people's, we have to ask questions rather than just give lecture, which is kind of sort of what I'm doing today. But either way, don't ever forget that the manager is also a teacher in a lot of ways. So I have a picture of Socrates up there, and he developed what was eventually called the Socratic Method. It doesn't really have a set definition per se, but you can kind of understand it as a teaching style, a form of cooperative, argumentative dialogic discussions, a form of inquiry debate. All these things can kind of be thought of as the Socratic method. So again, while there's no official version of the method or a universal accepted structure, etc., there are a set of steps. The Socratic method was used in a variety of ways and with a variety of aims. So in its loosest sense, the Socratic method has come to mean almost any teaching method involve questions and answers session. So what I have here is no one can really you can raise your hand, but I can't really see it. But who's seen the show House before? It's one of my favorite shows for a lot of many reasons. But if you're familiar with the show, it's about the arrogant Dr. House, who can be thought of as Socrates in a lot of ways, who's smarter than most any other person, and they're trying to figure out what is happening. So they just sit around and question each other the whole time until they figure out what's wrong with the patient. That is an idea of the Socratic method. So types of questions that can be asked are clarification questions. Why did you say what you said? Assumption questions. Can we assume this instead of that? Probe for reason or probe for evidence. So someone says something, you go, well, could you give me an example? What do you mean by that? Viewpoint, perspective questions, again, coming back to the theme of perspective. What will be an alternate solution? What will be an alternate reason for X happening? Probe the implications and consequences. So what are you implying? If somebody says something, try and take it to its end and go, what do you mean when you carry this all the way through? And then about the question, what was the point of this question? Why are you asking that? So really, Socratic method is about asking and challenging with open-ended questions. You build on the first question by asking why. You come up with ideas based on those answers, and then you keep interrogating until they come up with other reasons. Either they defend their reason or they can't defend their reason. Now there is a caution that remember to have balance. If you remember your history class, Socrates was put to death. So we don't want anyone having to be forced to drink hemlock in a public square and all that. But thankfully today, you can ask these type of questions to come at different solutions without being arrogant and being like a house kind of a thing. So I always say when you go into it with these type of thought processes, remember to pull back when you need to. So once you ask questions, you're going to get answers, right? So you need to be able to figure out the logic behind people's answers. Is this sound? Does this make sense? So a logical fallacy are things that all of us have used at one time or another. It's just inherent, unfortunately, or fortunately, during our learning process. We think X equals Y, so it just makes sense in our mind, but X really doesn't equal Y. It's a logical fallacy. They're flaws in reasoning. They're like, sometimes people can use them as tricks or illusions to try and get their way sneakily, like politicians or media. Sometimes people just use them without even knowing it, and there's no ill intent at all behind it. But recognizing logical fallacies is incredibly important at communication and trying to get down to the bottom of a lot of things. So I'm going to go over just some of the major ones and think about, have you ever seen these before, or have you ever used these before unwittingly? So straw man logical fallacy, that's misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to attack. It's putting up a fake argument, which is a straw man, right? It's not a real man, it's a fake man. Slippery slope. This one you probably heard before. If we allow A to happen, then Z will certainly happen. Therefore, we can't allow A to happen. This was a big, this was used a lot for in the early 2000s when gay marriage started coming on the national scene. There were a lot of slippery slope arguments as to why we shouldn't allow gay marriage per se. And as of today, not any of them have really come to pass. Like marrying pigs and all those other things, but I'm not going to get into that. False cause, which is post hoc, and you might have heard this phrase, post hoc ergo propter hoc. That's Latin for after this, therefore, because of that. So that's assuming that because B comes after A causes B. Now that's not true because correlation does not always mean causation. Just because something happens following an event doesn't mean that event caused that thing to happen. You have to get at the root causes of things. That's why a house, they're always trying to say they're finding the wrong symptoms, because you can have multiple symptoms for different diseases, but they're the same symptom, right? So you got to get to the root cause. Bandwagon, this is appealing to popularity or the fact that many people do something as an attempt to form validation. Think of the old, well, my buddies jumped off a bridge, so I jumped off a bridge. You know, when your mom or dad used to tell you, would you do that? You know, that's sort of the bandwagon effect. We all think of fake sports fans, just for an example. You know, during the 90s, there were, if people remember the 90s, I do, I'm dating myself. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it, but in the 90s in Chicago, there were a ton of Bulls fans. Then there weren't all of a sudden when the Jordan era ended. So you can kind of think of it like that. Ad hominem, that's attacking your opponent's character or personal traits instead of engaging in the argument. It's like saying, yeah, well, you're blonde, so I don't argue with blondes. You know, you're not going after the argument, you're trying to discredit the person instead of the argument. Anecdotal or hasty generalization, that's just using personal experiences or isolated examples. You know, that's like biases or stereotypes. Going back to the blonde thing again, it's like anecdotally, you know, I dealt with this blonde once. She was kind of dumb. I dealt with a second blonde. He was dumb. So all blondes are dumb. That's anecdotal, and that's a logical fallacy. Appeal to authority. This is using the opinion of an authority figure in place of an actual argument. Without getting into it a whole lot, you see a lot of that today. Instead of going into, let's say, almost hope I'm not regretting going into this, but you know, with the vaccine stuff, people hold up the CDC as the end all be all, when maybe it isn't in certain situations. Maybe these doctors make sense. And that's why we have all this confusion today, at least surrounding the vaccine. People are just holding up their own personal authority figures to try and figure out, well, what helps my biases and those type of things. So right, wrong, or indifferent. That's just an example. And finally, black and white. This is called false choice. You're presented with two states that are the only possibilities, when in fact there are more possibilities. The easiest example for this is the two-party system in the US. You can only vote for a Democrat or a Republican. Well, guess what? You don't. There are many other third parties or non-parties that people can vote for. Just in America, we choose, by and large, not over 5% usually not to. So, and there are many, many, many more, but these are ones that you could kind of see quite frequently. So with that comes to our first poll. So based on what we just talked about, which logical fallacy is this statement? After Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying that he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. Is that straw man, slippery slope, false cause, or bandwagon? And can hear Jeopardy music playing in the background. Oop. Did the poll pop up? If it did, I can't. Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, okay. Most 67% said false cause. That's actually a straw man article. Straw man, because he's saying that he's not attacking the original argument. He's propping up another argument in place. Will is not talking about cutting defense spending. That's not his argument at all. So why are you talking about defense spending, which is propping up that straw man? his argument is actually about how we need to invest more in health and education. So that's don't, if you didn't guess right or guess right, don't get too down on yourself. These things are new for a lot of people, and I think it just goes to show we need to take a look at some of these things sometimes to figure out where are people's arguments at. So, all right. Next, we talk about these things, and we need to figure out, okay, if we're asking questions, we're analyzing logic, we need to communicate in the right way. I want to talk about Buddhist idea of right speech. Now, Buddhism in particular is a fascinating religion or philosophy, philosophical religion, depending on how you want to say it. This is not meant to be preachy in any sort of way. This is just a fascinating concept I think works very appropriately for our discussion today. So real quick, there are four noble truths. Pretty much there's suffering, and the root cause of suffering is desire. You can overcome desire by following what's called the Eightfold Path in Buddhism. And I'm not going to go over the Eightfold Paths, but one of the Eightfold Path parts is right speech. So there is a proper way to communicate with everyone according to right speech. We always want to communicate and be heard and understood and bring and lessen the suffering of others and speak in a way that does not enhance suffering. Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk, stated, sometimes we speak clumsily and create internal knots in others. Then we say, I was just telling the truth. It may be the truth, but if our way of speaking causes unnecessary suffering, it is not right speech. The truth must be presented in ways that others can accept. Words that damage or destroy are not right speech. Before you speak, understand the person you are speaking to. Consider each word carefully before you say anything, so that your speech is right in both form and context. So, according to Thich Nhat Hanh, how do you get there? What is right speech? First is tell the truth. Don't lie, and don't turn things upside down. Don't exaggerate, call a spade, and that's it. Don't call it the whole deck. Be consistent. This means no double talk, speaking about something in one way to one person, speaking about it differently to somebody else. And use peaceful language. Don't use insulting or violent words, cruel speech, verbal abuse, or condemnation. Those are all the ways of how you have right speech. And something I don't think gets talked about enough is right speech also means how you talk to yourself. Don't forget, you talk to yourself more than you talk to anyone else. So if you're saying certain things to yourself that you would not say to someone else, why are you doing that? Why are you putting yourself down? So this is just a neat graphic I wanted to share. What your inner critic doesn't tell you, that you are more than enough, you're trying your best, and that's enough in this particular instance. If it's not enough, then do a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with you at this point. You don't need to be perfect to be successful. Nobody is. Mistakes are part of growth, and you need them. They're essential, right? You have genuine skills and strengths that need to be acknowledged. And it's okay to choose self-care instead of overwork or trying to meet the needs of everyone else. And that your worth is not tied to your job or your role. I think in America, we have a hard time with that last one. We always ask, think about when you ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? You're not asking them, what do you want to do? What do you want to become? You're asking them, what do you want to be as a job context? So from a young age, we're taught that our worth is in a job. So when we fail at a particular job, then we fail as a human being. That's not true. So think about self-criticism versus self-compassion. So instead of saying, I'm a failure, just say, I'm learning. That's the whole point of failure. It's the best teacher there is. How could I have done that into, I'm human. Sometimes I do things I wish I didn't, just make sure I don't do it again. I can never do things right. make mistakes as part of any learning process, and no one likes me. Yeah, it's okay if I'm not liked by everyone. So again, communication for leaders is much more complicated than the two-way street cliche. So we take all these things and now it's like, okay, how does this work at work? Leaders, at all levels need to know more about the mechanics and how to send and how to receive information. Leaders have to harness that ability to communicate effectively. We don't get the benefit of the doubt. Leaders need to think with clarity, express ideas, share information. Effective communication is so important because it leads to productivity in the workplace. It can increase the employee's job satisfaction, which again leads to more productivity in the workplace. And workplace communication has such a positive effect on absenteeism and turnover rates. So all managers and leaders need to figure out how to communicate well for the health of the organization. So again, communication in the workplace should occur in a way that responds positively to individual differences. So the way you communicate impacts your ability to get along with people and get things that you want done and things you need done. So communication happens in these 4 type of ways more often than not. Verbally, which encompasses the words you say and hear from others, primarily in person, but of course over the last almost 2 years, video chat has been huge with that. And again, with verbal communication, always the big hint is listen. It's more important than saying a lot of things. Just as important, if not more important in a lot of ways, is nonverbal communication. There's graphics that show a lot of times that say, 70% of communication is nonverbal. I'm not sure how substantiated that is or isn't. It's kind of unclear depending on whom you ask. But it's not at debate that human beings communicate substantially through nonverbal cues. So these are messages that we convey without using words. Everything from what our body language, vocal tone, voice inflection, all these things imply our position and how we're relating ourselves to the space around us. Written communication. I'm going to have a lot of really good slides at the end about written communication in the workplace, but think about email, text, Slack messages if you use Slack, or Teams if you have Microsoft Teams. All these things have gained a lot of prominence over the last decade, email even more so. But lastly, visual communication refers to the use of pictures, tablets, graphs, or other images. A lot of people say, I'm a visual learner, and there's something to be said for that. The human eye is incredibly complex and has evolved in such a way to where things catch our eye for various reasons. So using visuals is an important part of your communication. So as it relates to the philosopher manager, there are 4 important facts I want you to think about when it comes to communication. Authenticity counts a lot. That's just being honest and sincere. That's finding your voice, and it's not being fake. People can understand and cut through the BS. They know what's being fake and who's being real and authentic. People want leaders, and they respect leaders and will follow authentic leaders. So keep that in mind as you think about a lot of that. Visibility is a form of communication. If you want to communicate well, be in the office, be in sight. If you work remotely, hop on Teams, just shoot them a quick text, be around. Nothing creates such a leadership gap as somebody who's not around a whole lot. Again, I want to focus on listening. Listening is more important than hearing. Good communicators are good listeners every single time. When you listen well, you gain better understanding, more clarity on their perspective, on another person's knowledge. Listening fosters trust, respect, openness, and alignment. So think about how you can become a really good active listener. And contributing is just as important as receiving. So you're listening, which is good, but then you have to respond. So you have to figure out, how am I going to respond, and just kind of help give your team the deliverables that they need to get the job done. Skilled leader and effective communicator is not only good at transferring their own ideas, but also really good at aligning the ideas of their team. So here's some other tips that you can use to grow and become a better philosopher manager when it comes to communication. Number one is communicate relentlessly. I can't preach about this enough. One of my mottos at work is better to over communicate than under communicate. If people start getting annoyed because you're communicating with them too much, you're doing a good job. Because guess what? The minute you stop, hey, you didn't tell me that. I didn't know what was going on. You're not keeping me in the loop. Over communication is always better. And that's just a motto I live by. Simplify the message and be direct. Say what you mean, be direct, but do it in a way that, speaks to right speech. Being direct should not be an excuse for being a jerk. You can deliver a very good direct message without being a jerk about things. So don't hide behind complexity or hide behind a pile of a ton of information. Try and figure out how to distill it and simplify it. Listen again and encourage input. This one's incredibly hard, the second part of that, input. Listening is, I think, comes natural to me at least, but the other thing that doesn't come natural to a lot of people is encouraging them to have that input. You can stay till you're blue in the face, talk to me, open door policy, but you'll always find out down the line, well, how come you didn't tell me about this? Because they just didn't feel like they could. So it's trying to figure out not only to listen, but encourage people and create an environment to where they want to come to you and when they need to. So create empathy and psychological safety in your environments. Illustrate through stories. It's always kind of funny. I think some of the best communicators can tell really good stories, but then they tie that story to what they're trying to get across. I always think of like my grandpa, for example, was really good at this. Some people aren't. They'll just start telling a story and go down rabbit holes. Always make sure that it ties back to what you're trying to get across with people. And then finally, affirm with actions. Effective leaders and masters of the art and craft of language, speaking clearly, et cetera, they're really good at being able to get people to trust them and then turning that into actionable items. So when people come to you, know that they're coming to you to solve an issue. So figure out a way to solve their issue. So a quote to ponder is by Alan Lightman here. He's taken the philosophical approach disposition on email. Although he thinks it's a wonderful communication technology, it has a lot of good uses, is abused quite a lot. And I have a hard time arguing with that. We rely on email so much in modern day society that I ask you, do we often put thought into the messages that we are sending? Do we take time to understand the who, what, where, why, when, and how before we hit the send button? I would argue in a lot of cases, probably not. The workplace should always be thought of as a professional environment. That means that each type of written communication has an expected professional standard. And as philosopher managers, we need to toe that line. Some of the basic expectations of a really well-written email is that, again, it's simple, easy to understand. It's to the point and avoids unnecessary sentences. We don't need to be Hemingway and just have these big paragraphs of all that stuff. Don't put in too many technical terms, especially know your audience, right? Avoid slang, offensive language, and of course, you should go without saying discriminatory, racist, or sexist language. And I would also say, avoid the one-word responses. That drives me nuts sometimes, where someone just goes, yes. It's like, What? Unless I ask the direct question, can I buy this? And they say yes, okay. But why are you saying yes? What's the one word response? That we should do more than that. Another quick tip that I picked up too that I thought was really interesting and made me think, if you're spending more than 5 minutes on an email, it probably should be a phone call. I don't always buy that, but it's something that makes me think and go, okay, maybe I shouldn't send this email rather than I'll just write it and then send it. It at least gives me pause to think. So when communicating through email or other written communication, always think about your tone and how you're coming across, especially when it comes to passive aggressive comments. And I'm just going to say some of these were surprising to me a little bit. So think about per my last email. I might go, well, I use that all the time. Well, what it actually means is, hey, jerk, you didn't really read what I wrote. Pay attention this time. For future reference, what that actually means is, let me correct your blatant mistake that you've already knew was wrong. Bumping this to the top of your inbox, what that actually is saying is, you're my boss or you're my employee. This is the third time I've asked you. I need you to get this blank done right now. What are you doing? Just to be sure we're on the same page, what this actually means is I'm going to cover my behind here and make sure that everyone who refers to this email in the future knows that I was right all along. Then finally, going forward, what this actually means is do not ever do that again. So that kind of brings us to our next poll. So have you ever used any of these phrases in an email? Pick all that apply. And again, there's no right or wrong. Again, we got the Jeopardy music playing in the background. Oops. Get a few more seconds as they're being tallied and being brought in. There we go. All right. People have used all of the above. It's funny, everyone has used all of them. Number one is just to be sure we're on the same page at 54%. But then no one said that they used just bumping this up to the top of your email box. So again, I thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. And again, it's not to say that using these phrases makes you a bad communicator. That's not what this is saying at all. What this is saying, again, kind of, let's go back to one of the very first slides of this is perception. It's making sure that how you're communicating is being done in a way that can be received by the other person in a productive, forward moving way. And with that, think about more these, what does successful philosopher managers do to enhance their communication? Number one, don't respond to messages or emails when you're angry or frustrated. This prevents so much miscommunication, wasted time, regret, all those type of things. Always assume good intent. The one thing about email and communications is you don't get that voice inflection. You don't get the tone. You don't get what that person is saying in that exact moment because you're reading it. So you're reading it through your eyes, not their eyes. So much misinterpretation can go on that you think that they're out to get you, or that's not really the case. So just always assume good intent and then follow up. So, et cetera, et cetera. Show empathy and encouragement. Don't use conditional phrases like do this, or imperative phrases. I'm sorry. Don't use like imperative, do this. You have to do this now. Use other phrases like, could you do this? We would like this to get done at this time. What are your thoughts on it? You're showing the other person that you're valuing their time, that you're not ordering them around and discounting other projects that they have going on, for example. And finally, avoid digital ghosting. I think that ghosting term has been around for a while. It's like, when you don't show up, it's very passive aggressive to not follow up on emails. And that one is very true. Even if it's something like a quick, hey, I got your email. I know it's been a day or two. I've been a little swamped. I promise I'm going to get back to it by X. Just something like that, can go a very long way. Just don't ignore people. And again, it can't be understated, especially in all communication. Don't communicate when angry. Always compose yourself. Abraham Lincoln used to have a really good habit of writing what he called hot letters. So he would write someone and his generals when they weren't doing what he needed them to do during the Civil War. He'd write them these hot letters of how angry he was, et cetera, et cetera. But they were all found after he was assassinated in his drawer. He never sent them. So he did that on purpose. And the purpose for that is twofold. It's sort of an emotional catharsis. It's a way to let it all out without repercussions of true engagement. And it acts as strategic catharsis. It's an exercise in saying what you really think, which then you can turn into what you need to say in a positive direction to get to where you need to go. It allows you unallowable frankness and freedom, from what Mark Twain said, without having to send it, so you can get it all out and move on. I always thought that was a really good, a really cool thing to do. So this one I got through a little bit quicker than normal, only because I think some of the last two that I did, there wasn't a ton of time for Q&A. But for all of you that showed up to all three of these, or even just this one, I want to say the last few weeks have been some of the most entertaining and fulfilling of my professional life, of a lot of these things that I've done. Being able to bring you all this idea of the philosopher manager, it's been really amazing to me. It's something I've thought about, honestly, for about 20 years or so. And I hope to continue preaching, if I can use that word, about the positive attributes of philosophy and how that can help professionals in their everyday work life. Again, remember, philosophy isn't meant to be debated in hallowed ivory towers. Philosophy is meant for the streets, the boardroom, the packing plant, the office, wherever you are when you do work. Take it with you wherever you go, and you'll become a better leader, you'll become healthier, and you'll become a better communicator. So with all that, thank you, DCMP, thanks to Ben, thanks to Mark, all the attendees that were able to go through this series with me. And if you've been through all of them, I always say, give you all the sources that I've used during this to create this set. So when I first started, it was like 1.5 pages. It is now up to 3 pages. So, and some of them even have some links for you too. So with that, we go to Agora, but I'll put up my communication, or my my self-promotion, aka communication information, for anybody that wants it.
Thank you, Paul. So those of you in attendance, please feel free to use a Q&A, put it in the chat, or send it directly to me, and I will ask your question. But we have had a couple come in directly, Paul, and so we'll jump in. One person says, I'm early in my career, and it can be hard to question those who have more experience. How can I probe for clarity and question them respectfully without being forced to, quote, drink hemlock in the town square? Which is a nice touch by that submission.
That was a very nice touch. That's a very good question and difficult to answer in some ways. I always argue that all professional successes have some foundation in relationships in some way. So that is the relationship between you and your peers, you and your manager being probably the most important one, you and your subordinates as being equally as important. To have really good relationships creates time. And the only way you can do that is by continuing to communicate. I would say, even if you're not confident, feign confidence and go into it and just ask the questions. Ask clarifying questions. I think over time, you'll find that the right manager and the right people will respect that if you're doing it in a respectful way, and they'll go, hey, this person wants to know more. They're questioning things, not in a disrespectful way, but in a clarifying way. And I think that's the key. Ask clarifying questions. I don't quite understand this. Can you explain X, Y, Z so I can have a fuller understanding of what is needed? It's asking those type of things, and that will take time. And if people are pushing back against you, I would argue, you need to seriously think, is this the environment I want to be in? Is this a psychologically safe environment where I can grow and become the best professional I can be? Do they respect me enough to respond to my questions in a professional, courteous way? If the answer is no to a lot of those, it's time to start getting that resume ready. But I hope that was helpful. And yeah, leave before they make you drink the hemlock. Go to Sparta instead of Athens.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for that submission. The next question is seemingly equally as challenging. So this person says, knowing the logical fallacies is really helpful, but what do I do with that information? If the person using it doesn't know they are using a logical fallacy, then what comes next? I can work to avoid the logical fallacies myself, but what do I do when someone is using them against me?
You call them out. Now, you don't call them out by saying you're using this logical fallacy. It's like, no, you don't do that. But you call them out in a professional, respectful way. That, let's use the example from the poll, right? So you're talking to somebody about needing to increase healthcare and invest in education. And then the person you're talking to comes at you and says, well, why don't you like America? You want us to be defenseless by it's like, you call them out on and say, that's not what I'm saying. I didn't bring up defense. I have family in the military. Push it aside. My argument is on this. So you redirect it back to what your argument is. That's actually the key in knowing the logical fallacies. It's being able to know where other people are coming at you. Again, don't think ill intent unless you're in a political debate. That's different though. But on the stage, and I'm half being facetious with that, but that's the key in knowing the logical fallacies. It's knowing not to pick apart someone else, that's the wrong way, but how to guide somebody else to better thinking and understanding of what you're really trying to say.
This one kind of shifts the frame a little bit and asks, what recommendations do you have for broader public nonprofit communications and outreach? So how can we be most effective communicating with donors and other stakeholders using these principles?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that actually popped to my head is one of the things I said earlier, is communicate relentlessly. Be out there all the time. Think about the biggest, I'm trying to think, like the YMCA. You're not going to have, unless the YMCA is on this, you're not going to have necessarily a call, like a song, right? That's going to get your name out there and all those type of things. But over communicate with your donors. Send them a monthly newsletter, send them monthly check-ins, whatever it is just to keep your name at the forefront. So that's just one example, I think. Something I touched upon but didn't really dive into a whole lot is knowing your audience. So have different strategies for each one. You're going to talk to your donors differently than you're going to talk to the board, or if you're going to talk to somebody else. So I think it's just trying to find that in how you're communicating with all your various stakeholders.
Speaking of the board, I have a board member who likes to control the conversation. What recommendations do you have for working with this individual in a way that respects their position, yet demonstrates that the need for control is overbearing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes back down to what I started with too, is relationship building. All strong communication starts with that relationship piece. It's much easier to communicate with somebody who you have a strong relationship with than you don't. I'm not saying this is what you should do or shouldn't do, but I would say what I would do if there was somebody trying to control the conversation, whether it's in a public setting, etc. I would pull them aside one-on-one and be like, hey, can we just have a conversation about this? Are you receptive to hearing some feedback that can make us a better board, that can make you a more effective leader? And if hopefully they do say that they are, and then you can go into having those conversations. A lot of these things too, think about confrontation. Very few people like confrontation, but there is positive, constructive confrontation, or there's toxic confrontation. If you don't do the constructive one, eventually you'll have to do the toxic one.
Yeah, great questions submitted so far. And if any last minute questions come up, please submit them now. We have one more, and then I have a broader question about the series, Paul. This person asks, what is a philosophic response to someone who is difficult to communicate with, someone who is passive aggressive or verbally aggressive?
Oh, it's funny you say that. There is one of the I think one of the most inspiring books that I've read, and a lot of people, because it's been around for 2,000 years, is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And he is literally one of the very rare philosopher kings that Plato had talked about. Like a handful of people would have ever been able to literally be called that because they just didn't have it. But he was a philosopher king, Roman emperor. What he did was he just wrote to himself in his journal all the time, wherever he was. He never meant it to get published, but when he died, someone found it and it became the Meditations that you can find at any bookstore. One of the passages in the book was, and you can think about this as the emperor, he wrote, when I wake up today, you will come across, blaggarts and people who are just trying to come at you. You will come across ingrates. You will come across all these people, and he just names a list of all these things that annoy him, and he'll come across. And then he kind of ends the passage with, still do your best and realize that they're trying to do their best as well. And it's sort of his way of saying, you can't really control what those other people are doing, but you can control what you're doing. And what you can control is how you talk to them, the message you want to deliver to them. And at the same time, ultimately, you can control, do they bug you or not? You literally can rewire your brain to where that behavior doesn't bother you anymore. So I'm not saying you'll be able to wake up the next day and do that. And that's a very bloviated response, I think, to your question. But I'd say a very appropriate one, because that's what popped in my head first, was that if Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of one of the largest, most powerful empires in the world, is going through the exact same thing that you're going through, that was the advice that I would take.
Okay, so thinking about the entire series, Paul, what's the common thread, or what's your main thesis with this? What are maybe the couple of takeaways or lessons that you would encourage the audience to kind of distill from this three-part series?
I think number one is we are all learning creatures, and we need to continue to learn. And so that's one thing. The other is when you think about perceptions, and that is, going into this, you might have thought, philosophy, what the heck does that have to do with anything? But my hope is to show you that through this perception, philosophy can actually be a life-changing game changer for not only you personally, but your career as well. So it's always question your perceptions and what you really feel, and does that make sense to you? And if it does, should it? Always kind of question yourself before you start questioning kind of other things around you. And then I think lastly, it is, at the end of the day, we're all trying our best, and extend that grace to other people as well as yourself. That no one is truly really out to really get anybody except in rare circumstances. It's just other people's behaviors they haven't learned yet, right? Or they haven't come across the experience in how they should learn to really behave. Your example can help show them, and you learn that example through philosophy.
Well, this was a really impactful series, Paul, and I feel fortunate that we had you come alongside this effort and really lead us through this three-part series. I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and they were talking about just how good you've been, and I said, it helps that he's an expert in the content, and then when you layer on top of that the style, the delivery, it all comes together in a really high quality way. And so just want to thank you, Paul, for offering this series and partnering with DCNP on it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I'm happy to hear that it has made, even if it's a small impact in this little corner of the world, a good one. So I hope everyone that wants to can reach out, and I'll be happy to stay in touch with folks.
That's great. So a couple of things before we wrap up today. As I mentioned earlier, we'll send a follow-up evaluation email, and in that we'll also include today's recording as well as the slide deck. As we look ahead, we're offering a webinar on sexual harassment prevention on December 2nd, partnering with multiple chambers in DeKalb County and Safe Passage. And there's already over 100 people signed up for that. So RSVP today if you and your staff need to attend this mandated training for 2021, or if you're just interested in the topic and you happen to be with an all voluntary organization that maybe does not have that mandate. On December 9th, we'll host a virtual panel as we recap our Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Action Initiative. You'll hear from the 4 executive directors who participated in this year-long DEI initiative, and you'll also hear from our consultant, Delia Coleman, who helped lead that process. So for both of those webinars and anything that we have coming up, you can visit dcmp.org to learn more and also to register. The final thing that I'll mention is the Community Foundation is currently accepting applications for the Promise Grants program, which supports organizations that provide services to underserved populations in DeKalb County. You can learn more about that and also apply by visiting DeKalbCCF.org, and that deadline is coming up relatively soon. So if you're interested, you'll want to act on that soon. So once more, thank you for attending, and a big thank you goes to Paul Lalonde for sharing his time and expertise with all of us today. Thanks again, and take care.